Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.
Loud. Ooh. That was exciting. No. Good afternoon and welcome to the City Club of Cleveland. My name is Cecilia Render, Executive Director of the Nordson Corporation Foundation, and I'm pleased to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Ansley T. Erickson, Assistant Professor of History and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Erickson is a historian who focuses on educational inequality and the question of how schools matter in the American urban landscape and economy. In a radically unequal United States, schools are often key sites wherein injustice grows. It's a conversation we've had before at the City Club. In February 2015, economist Richard Rothstein discussed the implications of ongoing segregation in American schools since the landmark Brown versus Board of Education Supreme Court decision. Today, Dr. Erickson discusses her first book, Making the Unequal Metropolis, School Desegregation and Its Limits. In it, she presents a broad, detailed argument about the inextricable interrelatedness of school policies and the persistence of metropolitan-scale inequality. While many accounts of education in urban and metropolitan contexts describe schools as the victims of forces beyond their controls, Dr. Erickson argues the many ways that schools have been intertwined with these forces and have, in fact, via land use decisions, curricula, and other tools, helped sustain inequality. Based on her research, inequality emerges not only from individual racism and white communities' resistance to desegregation, but as the result of long-standing linkages between schooling, property markets, labor markets, and the pursuit of economic growth. Dr. Erickson earned her Ph.D. in U.S. history from Columbia University and has been Assistant Professor of History and Education at Teachers College since 2011. She's also an affiliated faculty member in the Columbia University History Department and the Teachers College's Institute for Urban and Minority Education. Making the Unequal Metropolis is an outgrowth of her dissertation, which won the 2010 Bancroft Dissertation Prize in the History of Education Society's 2011 Erickson Dissertation Prize. So ladies and gentlemen, members and friends of the City Club, please join me in welcoming Dr. Ansley Erickson.
Good afternoon. Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you, Cecilia, for that kind introduction, to Dan for the invitation to be here, to friends from Cleveland State in bringing me to Cleveland. It's, and especially thanks, given the august history of this institution's importance as a forum for civic discourse and hard thought. I study the history of school desegregation in the United States, but I'd like to start with the matter of segregation right now. In Nashville, 61 years after the Brown v. Board of Education decision, there are 5,140 black students who attend schools that are 90% or more African American and 90% or more poor. Research nationally, as well as local results, show that these schools are more likely to have lower levels of academic achievement, higher levels of teacher turnover, fewer external resources on which to draw. They lack the educational benefits of diversity that all students experience, including stronger cognitive functioning as a result of interacting with and working with those whose opinions differ from your own. Students attending these schools more frequently live in neighborhoods with concentrated poverty and the many layers of social isolation and struggle that brings. They are often locked out, physically as well as socially, from the benefits of Nashville's recent economic boom. This scenario is, of course, not unique to Nashville. Just this week, the Brookings Institution found the degree of segregation by class, the concentration of poverty, to be at some of the nation's highest levels here in Ohio's cities. and Cleveland schools are consistently ranked toward the top of national metrics of school segregation by race. Nor is this situation new, although it may be worsening. But in the last year, in part because of gifted journalistic storytelling, in part because of new research and advocacy, and in part because of new resources, segregation may be again a topic for public discussion and action. A few weeks ago, the U.S. Department of Education announced a $120 million program to encourage desegregation efforts. And just this week, they issued a call for ideas on socioeconomic integration as a school turnaround strategy. The Century Foundation counts more than 90 school districts nationally doing something, even if in some cases only a very minor something, in favor of desegregation. These are both small numbers compared to the scope of the nation, but perhaps they are initial steps toward a broader public conversation about segregation and desegregation. If so, history will matter tremendously. The stories of the places that have desegregated should help light the way. So in that spirit, I want to offer you a look at the history of one school system that, over the course of a 43-year-long court order, did desegregate its schools. At the beginning of our story, Nashville looks very much different than Cleveland in its scale and its organization. Nashville made major accomplishments in the peak desegregation years, in quantitative terms, and in the quality of social learning that could happen only in desegregated spaces. But in the process of desegregating, Nashville faced questions that any district would face, any district does face in thinking about desegregation today. How Nashville answered these questions often produced inequality in the process of achieving statistical desegregation. Desegregation was not a failure, but it generated much discourse that claimed it was. Any new attempts at desegregation will have to overcome this discourse of failure. But nor was desegregation an uncomplicated success. But today we have a stronger than ever research base on segregation's dangers and desegregation's values. We face the challenge of learning from these past complications to envisage a new way forward. So first we need to get located in Nashville, Tennessee. Nashville had two key features that produced desegregation in its schools. It had a metropolitan government, created in 1962 when city and county voters authorized a single municipality and a single school district. This district reaches across a 530 square mile area, making it a bit under half the size of Cuyahoga County in a single school system. That district served around 92,000 students in 1970, coming from urban and suburban and rural areas, both Black and white residents of various class backgrounds. The metropolitan structure meant that Nashville had a diverse population of students on whom to draw in making desegregated schools. Pressure to desegregate in Nashville came from a court case filed in 1955 by local parents and attorneys, and a court order for busing across neighborhood lines beginning in 1971. You'll note now the key differences with Cleveland, of course, where much segregation was visible not only within the district, but across the boundaries that separated suburbs from the city and from one another. The 1974 Milliken decision in the Supreme Court exempted suburbs from metropolitan desegregation, and for that reason, much of Cleveland's desegregation story is within the boundaries of the single city district. Busing in the metropolitan context created statistical desegregation in Nashville. It was one of the most desegregated school systems in the country, alongside other southern metropolitan systems in the 1970s and 1980s. And although the data is imperfect, it appears that Nashville aligned with the national pattern. It's an often underappreciated but crucial national pattern, that desegregation's peak years saw test scores rise for Black students and at worst remain steady for white students. Desegregation was a major achievement gap closing intervention. Consolidation plus court pressure created statistical desegregation in Nashville. But here's the rub. In Nashville, desegregation became a venue for the remaking of educational inequality as well. Desegregation is not a single thing. It is instead the accumulation of hundreds or even thousands of seemingly small and sometimes seemingly unrelated decisions. These are the policy choices that make desegregation what it is, not simply in terms of the black-white ratio in a given school, but in terms of the lives of individuals and communities. Decisions about where to open or close schools, or about what curricular goals to set for students, helped shape the experience of desegregation. And as various actors chose how to narrate desegregation, how to tell stories about what was happening in their communities during desegregation, they made additional layers of choices that shaped what desegregation became. I share this complex story of Nashville's accomplishments as well as its decided limits, not to add to perceptions of desegregation's failures. It is instead to suggest that, as we know more and more why desegregation remains important, we have historical examples to guide the way toward doing desegregation again, but better. And Nashville's case may be particularly valuable as today more and more urban districts see small but still significant shifts toward greater participation from middle class and white families. And simultaneously, many previously all-white suburbs are becoming much more diverse. Thus, both cities and suburbs might be becoming more like Nashville's metropolitan district. So to Nashville's desegregation story. In 1970, before busing began, about a third of Nashville's schools had 99% or more white students. Another third had more than 90% white students. About a fifth of the system's schools served 90% or more black students. This was more than a dozen years after court-ordered desegregation began in 1957. Desegregation without busing had not gotten very far. As of 1971, the federal district court ordered a busing plan that did not reach all of the county's schools, but did include 100 of the district's 133. And then starting in 1983, desegregation extended throughout the county, including all of its schools. From 1983 to 1998, almost no Nashville students in public schools attended schools that were more than 90% black or more than 90% white, the measure that many scholars use to designate a highly concentrated or highly segregated school. So statistically, Nashville desegregated until 1998 when resegregation began after the end of the court order. But there was a big space between statistical desegregation, which Nashville largely achieved, and substantive equality of educational opportunity. So I'll frame my investigation of how inequality was remade in the process of desegregation around three questions that seem simple, but prove to be important in how schools confront or continue educational inequality. Where did students go to school? What did schools teach to whom and why? And what stories did people tell about inequality and segregation? First, where did students go to school? Busing in Nashville often looked like this. Young black students boarding a bus after a day at school in a majority white suburban neighborhood. By design, Nashville's youngest students, first to fourth graders, were moved out of black neighborhoods to white majority elementary schools to mitigate white resistance to busing. Black urban students rode buses for 9 or 10 years of their schooling, while most white students did so for only 2 or 3 years. Busing for desegregation was about moving students out of neighborhoods to schools where they would meet students from other neighborhoods. But it was also about moving schools. Busing helped feed a spatial rearrangement of schooling out of the city and to the suburbs. The question was, in the context of desegregation, which communities get to have schools? In some, white suburban communities continued to enjoy proximity to schools in their residential neighborhoods, even though they didn't always feel that they still had it. Black families lost this sense of proximity and ownership. Initially, the federal officials helping shape Nashville's busing plan proposed closing all of the schools in Nashville's city center. The ultimate plan didn't do this, but it did close or downgrade the status of 8 central city schools immediately, and then over the course of the next decade, more were added for closure. Meanwhile, a suburban school construction boom was underway, some of it much needed because of overcrowding, but some of it not. This is part of why black students were more likely to ride out of their neighborhoods more frequently and for more years. This basic disparity in how desegregation worked was built into the landscape. After a decade of desegregation on this plan, many Black advocates pushed the school board to reconsider its approach to desegregation, to look for more fairness in the process. Barbara Mann was a school board member. She commented, quote, "To continually say to Black youngsters that, quote, in order for you to get something that is good, you have to move into another community. You are saying something that carries the impression and perception of inferiority. And I think that has a psychological impact on the youngsters who are moved outward." Her words highlight the sense of impact of a plan that burdened some more than others out of political choice. She's thinking of desegregation's process as a kind of public pedagogy, a kind of message about who can expect what from their government. And then she continued, "I don't think Black people live in places that are not fit for schools." Notice the construction of this sentence. What she's speaking to is how much discourse and how much policy at the time did suggest that Black communities weren't fit for schools in the judgment of white people in power. Some of the closures were particularly poignant, as at Buena Vista School. The school, previously segregated white, had been bravely desegregated by Black first graders in 1957. It was then closed 20 years later. The neighborhood was now all Black and deemed unattractive to white families. We should understand this problem of the avoidance of Black communities in the process of desegregation in context of decades of divestment and disruption in urban space. Highway construction bisected Nashville's historically Black neighborhood, destroying homes, cutting in half the core Black business district, and erecting a huge and ugly elevated barrier between the campuses of Nashville's 3 historically Black colleges. Urban renewal projects in other areas of the city brought displacement and expropriation as well. With this context in mind, Reverend Lester Stone argued for the preservation of the only historically Black high school standing in Nashville as of 1980. In this context, he described his community as, quote, "a group of people who suddenly find that everything that was once of great importance to them has gradually been eroded." He saw the potential high school closure as threatening a, quote, "final coup de grace." Desegregation's process, the thousands of small decisions that gave it shape, conveyed many damaging and often racist messages about the spaces of the metropolis. These decisions framed Black communities as places that could be systematically divested from, of Black communities as having less of a claim on municipal resources, because their claim was bounded by the nature of white resistance. School location and assignment decisions revealed who had what power and who mattered in a diverse metropolitan district. Now, a second seemingly simple question. What did schools teach, to whom, and why? Curriculum has long been a site of contestation in education, not only in the culture wars about sex education or prayer in school, but in economic terms as well. Think of the early 20th century struggles between Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois over the best routes to African American progress. And in the 1960s, Nashville gives us another example of this struggle. Vivian Henderson was an economist at one of Nashville's historically Black colleges, Fisk University. Henderson used the tools of the social scientist to find levers for economic opportunity for Black workers. He studied the local employment scene, and he saw very few Black workers in semi-skilled trades. In this, he saw an opportunity, curriculum as targeted to the needs of specific groups to create access. He wanted vocational education courses that could move Black workers from the unskilled to the semi-skilled strata of the labor market. At the same time, Nashville's mayor made the first of several pushes to link education to economic growth, to prepare students as workers who could attract new industry. His efforts ultimately contributed a major expansion of vocational education in Nashville. A decade after he made his first remarks, the district used local funds to open a huge new comprehensive high school with extensive vocational offerings. Then the state helped, expanding this model throughout the district via the 1973 Comprehensive Vocational Education Act. It put the equivalent of $900 million in 2010 terms into building comprehensive high schools in Tennessee. Although I haven't researched it, Ohio is the only other state to have done a similar thing. This vocational education investment rests in major part on a view of students as future workers who can leverage economic growth broadly. The vision is of growth forming a rising tide, raising all boats. We should notice the contrast between the mayor's and the state's view of vocational education on one side, and Vivian Henderson's on the other. Henderson had a view of targeted education that recognized the existing racism in the labor market and sought to figure out how to leverage students who had previously been locked out of it. The state's efforts spoke of growth, and much less about the distribution of its benefits, or about fixes for the still segregated and still unequal shape of the local labor market. In practice, seeing students as future workers opened the way for tracking and segregation inside schools, and for avoidance of desegregation more generally. Waverly Crenshaw was a high school student in Nashville who came out of a segregated black middle school with strong grades and a focus on academics. He arrived at his big new comprehensive high school to find himself assigned to vocational classes by his guidance counselor. White families who wanted to avoid assignments to high school in majority black neighborhoods could claim a curricular interest, the need to take a horticulture class or a key punch class, and then get a school transfer to a school with a larger white population. Embracing vocational education encouraged teachers and students to think of students as future workers. Doing so in the context of lingering segregation and still visibly racist and unequal labor markets meant bringing inequalities of the world into school more than challenging them. Thinking of students as future workers helped transform school-level desegregation often into classroom-level resegregation. I think this is of particular importance right now as we think of national interest in career and technical education, and as we also think about the important locally focused efforts to build economic growth in places like Cleveland as well as many others. And the third question, an especially crucial one today and in Cleveland, I think, is about the stories that people tell about segregation and desegregation. At each juncture in Nashville's desegregation story, various actors crafted narratives to explain why they thought things were as they were. Looking at the persistence of school segregation in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the school board and its attorneys turned to one such narrative. They called the segregation in Nashville de facto, suggesting that it had no cause they could name, or if there was a cause, it was outside of government control. The idea of de facto segregation is a common narrative that is often deployed in thinking about segregation. Perhaps you expected to hear it here, or you think of it as a descriptor for a northern city, maybe even Cleveland, that didn't have statutory segregation. But there are just too many policies that made segregation, in housing, in schooling, and at times in linking the two together, to call segregation in Nashville in the 1970s, in Cleveland in the 1970s, or in either place, de facto. To cite one important example, federal mortgage policy actively segregated the metropolitan landscape, giving mortgages to white families moving to the suburbs, in blue and green on this map, and barring black families from doing the same, or from becoming homeowners in their city neighborhoods, in red and yellow. This is not only about state action in making segregation between the eastern suburbs and East Cleveland, for example, here. It's also about state action in helping produce a massive wealth gap between Black Americans and white Americans today. There are ample other examples, from public housing location decisions to urban renewal and more, that show how deeply structured segregation has been in the American landscape, how invested government policy has been in white wealth and in Black poverty. Given the broad range of policy routes that fostered segregation, and the impossibility of assigning a time when their impact is no longer present, the de facto framing should be rejected. Another powerful narrative needs investigation as well: white flight. To be sure, the departure of white, and especially white middle-class students from the Nashville schools in the 1970s mattered. It threatened funding levels, shrunk the public base of support for the schools, and made shifting and balancing student assignments a struggle. So of course it was of real consequence. But white flight mattered not only as a fact, but as a narrative, a way of understanding what desegregation was and wasn't. In many circles, white flight became the dominant narrative of desegregation's meaning and impact in the 1970s and 1980s. Other factors, the baby bust of the 1970s, or as in places like Cleveland, ongoing patterns of white departures from the city that were well underway decades before busing, get pushed out of view, and also the educational benefits of desegregation get pushed out of view in focusing only on the narrative of white flight. White flight as a dominant narrative reinforced the local emphasis on the resistance of white families to desegregation over the experiences of black and white students in school. And when, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, various groups in Nashville tried to redefine busing toward more fairness for students, reducing the burdens black families and communities had been facing, white flight became a kind of trump card in that conversation. As the school board's attorneys put it in 1980, if, quote, white children are the primary educational resource for black children, the possible development of a poor and black public school system alongside a middle and upper class white private school system is the ultimate in burden for black students. We should listen to how this statement defines white students as the primary educational resource for black students. It leaves no space for the educational benefits of desegregation for black students as well as for white students. And it leaves no space in which to argue for fairness in the process of desegregation, because inequalities are recast as necessary for white participation. Narratives like de facto segregation and white flight obscured segregation's origins and allowed white resistance to set the terms on which educational justice could be pursued for black students. Recent research shows that segregation is a major impediment to learning, especially for poor children and children of color. It shows that desegregation also has marked educational benefits. Thus, desegregation is crucial, a moral imperative, in my view. But statistical desegregation alone is not enough. Statistical desegregation is not the same as substantive equality in schooling or equality in the process of desegregation. I hope Nashville's story can ask us to see how desegregation, just like many venues of education policy more broadly, can become themselves sources of inequality. Designing desegregation to avoid black neighborhoods is one example. Tying schooling to promises of economic growth and mobility without creating protections against often unjust labor markets is another. And telling stories about education today that refuse to reckon with a long and varied set of policies that structured American segregation or that distort the history of desegregation is yet another. The fact that even desegregation's best case scenarios like Nashville have these complications, these paradoxes, is not a prompt for us to dismiss desegregation today. It is instead a prompt for us to think anew about what's next. It's a prompt to recognize the deep historical roots of inequality we see today and to think boldly. Compared to the strength with which American segregation has been built and sustained, school desegregation efforts to this point, even the most ambitious, as in Nashville, have been quite modest and at times deeply compromised. We need a new, bolder vision informed by a clear-eyed view of the past. I look forward to hearing your questions and ideas.
Thank you very much, Dr. Erickson. I'm Dan Moulthrop, Chief Executive here at the City Club. Today we're enjoying a Friday forum featuring Dr. Ansley Erickson, Assistant Professor of History and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Dr. Erickson appears as part of our Education Innovation Series, which is sponsored by the Nordson Corporation. We're about to head into the Q&A, and we welcome questions from all of you, City Club members, guests, students, and those of you joining us via our radio broadcast, our webcast, or our new live simulcast at the Parma Snow branch of the Cuyahoga County Public Library. If you're not in the room and you'd like to tweet a question, or if you are in the room and you'd still like to tweet a question, you can tweet it at the City Club, and our staff will try to work it into the program. Some members earlier asked me to mention what's happening next Friday. That's Joanne Jenkins. She's the CEO of the AARP. She'll be talking about disrupting aging. Gentlemen, we hope to see you there. Thank you. All right. We encourage you to make sure your questions are brief and to the point. Let's get started. Holding our microphones today, our content associate, Teddy Eisenberg, and our marketing and outreach fellow, Faye Walker. May we have the first question, please?
Good afternoon. I'm so glad you're here.
Hi.
First of all, I wanted to lift the name of Reverend Bruce Clunder, who was killed run over by a bulldozer protesting the building of a segregated school in Cleveland. He died April 7th, 1964. And I just wanted to lift his name because that happened down the street from me when I was growing up. And so I just felt he should be mentioned here.
Thank you.
Can you speak about the existence of charter schools and how so much research has said how they are exacerbating segregation and also taking students from previously integrated schools or neighborhoods?
So as you have heard in my introduction, and as I will say now to help frame the context for all of these comments, I study the 70s and 80s and 90s and sometimes the 30s and 40s, and as a historian, I want to be very cautious about making direct connections between those sections of time and our present day, and also to respect the limits of my own research. So I don't work specifically on charter schools. I know that Nashville, like many other places, I think it's similar to Cleveland in this respect, has invested deeply in charter school expansion over the last 10 years. Nashville's currently got about a third of its schools are maybe just under a third of its schools are charter schools. So I think about this question in that context. And so the question I have is not so much a question about charter schools as a structure, but what those folks in charter schools are doing around this question of segregation and desegregation. Because we certainly have examples in the charter school community of schools that define themselves quite intentionally in favor of desegregation. But it's also the case that those aren't just happening, that these are people in charter schools who are very intentional about defining their enrollment priorities, sometimes defining their curriculum, defining their practice in ways that align with a desegregation goal rather than a segregation goal. Nashville actually had an interesting moment a couple of years ago in which a charter school operator proposed to open a new charter school in the majority white western suburbs of the city. And the school board ended up opposing that effort because they were concerned about the presence of that school furthering segregation in the district, and suffered a fine from the state commissioner of education, actually, for that decision. Interestingly, though, there are lots of segregated African-American charter schools in Nashville, so this was actually a sort of concern about the creation of a segregated white school rather than the existence of lots of segregated black-serving charter schools at this point. So I agree with you that it's a crucial question. I think that it's certainly a politicized question in the ways that every part of the charter school landscape is a politicized question, but it doesn't seem to me like it has to be only that, because there are enough examples of people in the charter school community standing up and valuing desegregation as part of the charter school work that I think we can learn a lot from.
Well, thank you so much for being here. My name is Tim Goller. I could probably speak to the charter school piece. I'm a founder of a network here in Cleveland called HBCU Preparatory Schools. But I want to speak to the narrative of busing. For instance, I was in the Cleveland School District myself, and I was bused. I graduated in '84. So I went to Glenville High School and then got bused across town to Lincoln West High School. All my whole high school life. And I could tell you that just from that experience, I think we did meet, for instance, the de facto or not the statistical desegregation, right? But what I've always thought was when we bust poor to poor, we have the same issues there. So I always felt like if there was busing, if they really wanted to do it right, they should have bused us like the Solon or Beechwood or Westlake or Avon or something. That would have been different. So I'm wondering if in your research, have you seen examples of socioeconomic desegregation where it's worked in the United States?
Yeah. So in some ways, I don't know the specific suburbs that you're referencing, but in some ways, Nashville's case is one in which kids from central city neighborhoods went out to those suburbs. Nashville is a huge district, and for somebody who would have graduated from high school in 1984, you would have likely gone to one of all of those big comprehensive high schools that Nashville built were built in the suburbs. And so you would have been traveling out in that respect. So the first thing to notice, right, is the power of that metropolitan-scale district. And because of the Supreme Court's decision in 1974 in Milliken, essentially exempting the suburbs from metropolitan-scale segregation, that conversation has never been possible in the North in the ways that it was in the metropolitan South. Talking to people here over the course of the day, and especially talking to folks in inner ring suburbs, seeing demographic changes, and then second ring suburbs seeing demographic changes, it still sounds like there might be a lot of incentive for some schools folks to think about metropolitan solutions. I'm sure there are also a lot of obstacles. So to your question about where it has worked, with more space in the book than here, I try to talk about the ways in which Nashville did work, and some of the very powerful stories that are not the same as broad claims about achievement changes, but about individual learning and individual views of justice, I really try to emphasize in the book. And so those happen even in the context of sometimes very imperfect approaches to desegregation. Right? So I don't want to leave you with the impression that I would label Nashville's desegregation a failure. I think it was complicated. And I think that for many students I spoke to, it created meaningful changes in their lives in ways that they would want to hold on to. I'm lucky in that other folks have looked more broadly at this question nationally. There's a sociologist also at Teachers College named Amy Stewart Wells who wrote a book that includes a sixth of the stories in that book are from Shaker Heights, Ohio. And she tells us very robustly what students learned and also what students felt they lost in that process. So then, the socioeconomic integration questions. I think the places I would look now to think about this question are in districts like Hartford, Connecticut, where there is an inter-district magnet plan. Hartford looks more like Cleveland than it looks like Nashville. And the inter-district magnet efforts there include a very intentional desegregation effort. So, hope that helps. Okay.
Thank you, Dr. Erickson. This question actually is connected to the previous question, I guess. I was interested in your description of the structural differences between the Nashville school district and a school district, a situation like we have in Cleveland, where they had this large metropolitan school district. So, and it sounds like the topic of how desegregation proceeds in those two environments is a pretty rich topic that probably could get a lot of attention in other contexts besides the work that you've done. So, and could be a topic for research other places. So my question is, in the Nashville situation, did they find themselves, you mentioned that they had inner-ring suburbs, but those inner-ring suburbs were within the metropolitan school district. So knowing the power of white flight, did they wind up with the equivalent of inner-ring suburbs just outside on the rim of the metropolitan school district? Or, so did it replicate itself in a similar way to what you have without the large metropolitan school district? Is that question making sense?
Yeah, absolutely, okay. Absolutely. So white flight is a part of the story in metropolitan school desegregation as well as in fragmented school desegregation. I would describe the Cleveland metropolitan area as fragmented, right? You have small city and lots of small separate suburbs. So metropolitan consolidation slows the process of white departures from desegregating schools. It doesn't stop it, but it slows it. So you can, rather than just moving a few miles down the road, in Nashville's case, you might have to move 10 or 15. And that, for many families, was enough of a barrier that it made trying to think about staying close by more attractive. The two phases through which desegregation happened, until 1983, there was a ring of suburban schools that were not covered by the busing order. And so there's a lot of migration outside of that first boundary. And then after the 1983 expansion, there is migration out of the county. And so Nashville has a very booming county to the south, Williamson County, which is one of the richest counties in the nation at this point. that drew a lot of people who wanted to leave the city school system. I made a decision early in this project that while I think this story is crucial, like the white resistance story is crucial, it's also gotten a lot of good attention from historians who have thought about all of the ways that sort of the silent majority took form and school desegregation helped foster it. But I decided I really wanted to understand what happened for the majority of people who stayed. And I didn't want our historical narratives to be told only by those who left. And so for that reason, the story I'm trying to offer you needs to take stock of the white flight question, but needs to also not become captive of it. So, thanks.
Hello, I'm Ramir Williams. I'm currently a 10th grader at Richmond High School. My question is to you. When I first started going to Richmond Heights as a kindergarten, majority of the school were Caucasian. And today, I'm a 10th grader, and the majority of the school are African Americans. I don't think the neighborhood has changed drastically how the school population has. What factors can make a school change like that?
Thank you for that great question. Many. So I want to take one angle on this. So I don't know Richmond specifically, right? And there might be factors in the neighborhood that I should be attentive to, and I'm not able to because I don't know it specifically. But I think the broader question you're asking might be this. Let's say that there are both white and black families in Richmond still, and increasingly only the black families are in the public schools. Is that what I'm hearing? Then the core question is how people, and especially people with a lot of resources, and often one of those resources is white privilege, make judgments about what qualifies as a good school, right? And so I think one of the things that's crucial about this new wave of research on the importance of being in diverse spaces, not just for broad and I think very important civic goals, but for in terms of basic educational goals, you learn more when people who see the world differently than you argue with you, right? And the fact that we think that very, very good schools are places where lots of very, very privileged white kids talk only to each other, that doesn't align with what that research says. So I'm concerned for you that your school is increasingly segregated, but I think one of the things that has to happen right now is for us to turn the conversation a little bit to think about the problem of segregated white suburban schools. And maybe in doing that, you're in a better position to talk to Richmond families about what they could gain at school with you versus what they might lose if they left. So thanks for the question.
My question relates to the teachers. In your prepared remarks, you mentioned that in the 80s, your research revealed improved achievement in the desegregated schools, and that achievement improvement was lost as resegregation came into effect. Now, I know in the 50s and 60s here in Cleveland, teachers were assigned essentially where they wanted to based on seniority, and guess what? The senior, read white teachers were all on the white schools, and new teachers, inexperienced, were uniformly assigned to the east side of Cleveland, which at that time was in the black area of Cleveland. So my question to you is, do you attribute any of the improvement in the desegregated success of the 80s to the fact that the teachers were also reassigned?
It's an interesting question. I suspect the real answer would have to vary location by location, right? So in Nashville's case, teacher desegregation happened the year before busing for students. So a previously very segregated teaching faculty was reassigned by court order in 1970. And for a lot of teachers, that was a very hard process, in some ways even more so for black teachers who had been most likely in stable teaching positions in majority black schools for a long time. And then because of the shape of the majority requirements, the schools were supposed to be 80% white teachers, 20% black teachers. That meant that, especially for that first year, lots and lots of black teachers had to leave historically black schools. I think that it's possible that reassignment is part of the story. It's definitely the case that inequalities in how teacher assignment has worked without attention to desegregation has been historically a problem. That's very visible in New York. I study Harlem currently, and one of the parts of the story in the 1950s and 1960s is the incredible churn in often unlicensed teachers in central city neighborhoods in those years. So to the extent that thinking about teacher reassignment helped balance expertise and helped balance access to skilled teaching, I think that's an important part of the question.
Thank you for taking on such a daunting topic. Sounds like you did pretty well in your dissertation. Your attention to narrative and myth, I think, is helpful because humans do need simplifying concepts when they look at complex topics. It is particularly true of education that it is both a technical education task and a political task. And you've pointed out that the question of making desegregation achieve some degree of equality was an ongoing political challenge. One new narrative in talking about politics and complex institutions is the rhetoric of top-down and bottom-up. And a lot of desegregation history is necessarily top-down with facts flowing in from the bottom. And in the bottom-up world, politics, general politics, political power, is one of the great phenomena of the bottom speaking, the bottom coming up. What happened to black political power during the era that you're looking at the educational advances in Nashville?
It's a crucial, thank you for that crucial question. So metropolitan consolidation does enable statistical desegregation. Metropolitan consolidation also takes a city that was about 38% African American and merges it with a county that was less than 5% African American, so that through the crucial early 1970s years, about 17% roughly of registered voters, if I'm remembering the statistic correctly, are African American voters at the metropolitan scale. And so there are a few city councilmen who represent majority black districts, but Nashville's metropolitan government is drawn on a strong mayor model. So the mayor, who's elected at large, has tremendous power in that government, and the city council, which is by some descriptions so big as to be ineffective. It has 41 members, 6 of whom are elected at large. And that 6 was the same number as the number of likely majority black districts in the drawing of the original set of districts. So metropolitan consolidation does dilute black political power in consequential ways. And it's less so today, in part because of the changing demographics of the city, but also in part because of the increased presence of black leaders in civic life. But a lot of what the first few years of desegregation, 1971 to 1975 roughly, were tremendously consequential in shaping what desegregation would mean for the next 2 decades. And those were 2 decades where black political voices had a much harder time accessing this conversation. Now, the one asterisk on that is that the leading plaintiff's attorney who brought this case was also a state senator. So he's an example of black leadership in Nashville who understood the need to think about court-focused strategies, but also to be thinking about the electoral process. And he was a huge organizer in black voter registration and in various other ways of trying to organize democratic participation amongst African Americans in Nashville. But in short, we have 2 issues. One is the relatively shrunken presence as a minority in a larger metropolitan district. And the second one is the shape of a court-focused process. So who makes decisions in desegregation? When the school board is appointed by the mayor, and it was, and the judge orders the Department of Health, Education, and Welfare to come into the room and explain how desegregation should happen. Those are a lot of very closed spaces. So there was a lot less ground for political engagement than some other examples would offer. So thanks for the question.
Hi, thanks for being here. As you may know, Cleveland, we have school choice across the school district. So I'm curious to know, in your research or in what you're looking at, how school choice across a school district relates to segregation or desegregation.
So remember that thing about how I'm a historian? So I want to make sure not to assert any sort of broad findings here. I'll just share some questions. So the first question is what the boundaries of choice are. When Nashville started, when Tennessee initiated charter school development, charter schools were required to serve only children who were in schools deemed to be failing under No Child Left Behind. So charter schools were written into law as more likely to be serving higher poverty populations and African American kids. So at that point, Nashville operated many, many charter schools that were segregated institutions. So that's one view. That's one of the limits. Another limit is the power of the district boundary. So if there's district-wide choice, but your district is a small suburban district, which is now majority African American and majority poor, district-wide choice may or may not mean much, right? There are other approaches to school choice, of course, that intentionally encourage boundary crossing, right? And perhaps those are places to look for more of an assertive move towards desegregation. But I'm sort of coming back to the same point I made earlier. I don't think that choice alone is either the problem or the answer. I think the question is how choice is shaped in relationship to this really, obvious yet ongoing and intractable problem of segregation.
Hello, I'm an 8th grader at Richmond Heights, and I was just curious on what were your preparations for speaking on this topic?
Oh, thank you for that question. Well, I was going to make a joke, but I was worried about radio time, so I didn't. About the Phi Beta Kappa motto and a connection to lifelong learning. And I thought, oh yeah, this is lifelong learning, because I've been working on this project for 13 years. So, young man, about the time that you were born, I started reading about Nashville schools. So that's humbling for me. So my process was to think about a question that I cared about and to think hard about why I cared about it. So I was a high school teacher in the South Bronx when I found out that I was going to spend a year in Nashville. And I had a lot of lead time on this, so I got to do some reading and I got to think, what is the city and what's the deal? And if I were a teacher there, what would it mean? And for me, in my classroom in the South Bronx, I had this set of contradictory feelings about the problem of segregation, because I simultaneously knew that there was no argument that my school was a segregated school, right? But I also knew that my students were brilliant. And so I wasn't comfortable with this idea that because the school was segregated, it was failing. But I also wasn't comfortable with the idea that its segregation didn't matter. There were things about that building that were crumbling around our ears that would never have been crumbling around our ears had we been elsewhere. So when I went to Nashville, I wanted to know more about this. And I actually worked on a documentary film project for a year. And I collected a whole bunch of stories. And I listened to the ways people described their experiences in desegregation. But then I realized that I learned a huge amount from those stories, but they didn't tell me enough about exactly why things happened as they did. So then I spent the next few years reading about 40,000 pages of documents. So I hope someday you'll take on a big project like that. Thanks very much.
Thank you. Today at the City Club, we have been enjoying a Friday forum, okay, lost my voice while I was sitting there, featuring Dr. Ansley T. Erickson, Assistant Professor of History and Education at Teachers College, Columbia University. Today's forum is the Cleveland Association of Phi Beta Kappa Endowed Forum. Our community partners are the Cleveland State University Center for Educational Leadership and Teach for America. We thank all of you for your support. Special thanks to today's table sponsors, Breakthrough Schools, the Cleveland Transformation Alliance, and NEOEA. Student participation from Richmond Heights, where we had some questions from. Secondary school was made possible by the Mary Jane Spar and Charles E. Spar Charitable Trust. Lastly, the sale of Dr. Erickson's book, Making the Unequal Metropolis, School Desegregation and Its Limits, is provided by a cultural exchange. That brings us to the end of today's forum. Thank you, Dr. Erickson. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. This forum is now adjourned.
For information on upcoming speakers or for podcasts of the City Club, go to cityclub.org.
Production and distribution of City Club forums on IdeaStream is made possible by the generous support of PNC and the Raskin Family Fund, with additional funding from Cleveland State University, Robert Conrad, and the Payne Fund.